Where are you getting this information that Paul got this meeting with Peter and James? Where's the information coming from?
All across the country, 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock, depending on where you live, we get the eyewitness news.
In this analogy, are you also putting air quotes around the hearsay Bible claims?
And you didn't just call somebody on the phone or use, Xerox or something.
Whoa, slow down with all this technobabble, Zuckerberg. We're not all sipping Soylent kombucha on a Jeff Bezos launch pad.
Bro, it's me.
Point taken. Man whose brand new book on the resurrection rarely references scholarship from the last decade.
Scholars today put this testimony at immediately after the crucifixion. Even skeptics, immediately after the crucifixion.
That's completely false.
Okay, well, thanks for checking in.
Well, this should be fun. Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. Bart, welcome back.
Thanks for having me back.
Our discussion today is inspired by Professor Ehrman's upcoming course, Did Peter Hate Paul? And while the topic is fascinating, maybe the best thing about the course is the price.
Hey, it's free. How good can it get?
Seriously, if you've ever been on the fence about maybe wanting to try one of Bart's courses, but couldn't afford it, or weren't sure it'd be worth the money, this is the one for you. Simply go to tinyurl.com/BartHate and see what all the fuss is about with absolutely no cost to you.
Seriously? It's free?
There's going to be some really interesting stuff in this course that, in my experience, people wouldn't have thought of some of this stuff or heard of it.
It's free.
I have here your New Testament textbook. Perhaps you will recognize it.
I've seen it before, yes.
And I have here my newest acquisition, which is Gary Habermas's book on the Resurrection, Evidences, Volume 1. I don't know if you've heard of this book.
No. Volume 1. How many volumes will there be?
So there will be 4. It's going to be this book. I don't know if you noticed. There's your book, and there's his book.
Yeah. And my book has a few pages on the resurrection. His whole thing is the resurrection.
This is 1,000+ pages, and I don't understand, Bart, how I can possibly take yours seriously when this is so fat and thick.
I'm telling you. Well, if you don't believe his argument, at least it'd be a good doorstop. That's a hefty book you got there.
It is. I put it on my bathroom scale. It is 5 pounds even.
When did you plan that?
Maybe. So Gary's been working on this for 14 years with a staff. And there will be, the first volume is the evidence of his minimal facts case. Second volume is responses to naturalistic claims. The third volume will be his research. So he interviewed 250 scholars. He will finally publish a detailed analysis of that. And volume 4 is just his personal musings. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
Could you explain volume 3 to me? How's that research and which 250 did he choose?
I have no idea.
I wasn't one of them.
I don't know if you're familiar with Gary's minimal facts argument, but it goes on whatever he can get a 90% consensus on different facts.
Yeah, but consensus among whom?
Well, this is the trouble, is for decades now he's thrown these numbers out, but he has not allowed anyone to analyze who they are and what they answered. So allegedly in volume 3, what we're going to get is the detailed surveys that he used to get to the data in volume 1 and 2. So it's kind of backwards, but
among 250 people? Okay.
He says that they are scholars in inappropriate fields, whatever that means. So we'll all find out. We'll all find out in a year.
And it's a great way to do scholarship, by the way. Just get a show of hands, and then you know the truth. Okay, whatever.
Well, so as you know, his minimal facts, I'll get to that point. His minimal facts are 6 facts that he feels he can back up, both with reasonable evidence, but also scholarly consensus. And he weighs very heavily on scholarly consensus, as you say, the ring of hands. You'll be pleased to know that you are the most quoted person in this book by a long shot.
How funny. I bet I'm not in the consensus, am I?
Well, to the extent that literally I read this whole book. I call this book Argumentum ad Bartum, is a phrase that I have come up with, because anytime you and Gary agree, he feels that he does not need to provide any more evidence. It's just, here's a point where Bart and I agree, so let's just carry on, versus, areas where you might disagree.
Okay.
So his favorite quote that he used of yours, and he used it 6 times in the book, you'll likely recall it from your book, Did Jesus Exist? can we get any closer to an eyewitness report than this? And that is in reference to the meeting in Galatians 1, where Paul meets Peter and James. Do you recall that at all?
Oh, yeah.
So Gary uses that 6 times. The first time is in a chapter about the historicity of Jesus, and so he uses it appropriately. The other 5 times, he ties it to 1 Corinthians 15, for example, in chapter 8.
Ehrman allows repeatedly that many of the exceptionally early creedal traditions that Paul received and recorded in the earliest New Testament writings likely came from Jerusalem, were established and in existence even before his conversion at just 2 to 3 years after Jesus' crucifixion, and most likely would have come from apostles like Peter, John, and James, the brother of Jesus. Ehrman asks, can we get any closer to an eyewitness report than this?
That's completely false. It's completely wrong. So, look, I have never, ever said that these traditions began in Jerusalem. I've never thought that. I've never said it. I've never said that they were around before Paul converted. I've never thought that. So, he's making stuff up. He's saying that because I think that Paul got traditions from the apostles, that therefore I think that Peter told him about his resurrection appearance. I don't know if Peter did or not. I mean, I personally think Peter had a resurrection appearance. I mean, in other words, I think Peter thought he saw Jesus. So that's absolutely right. It's got nothing to do with 1 Corinthians 15 coming from a pre-Pauline. I'll tell you the problem, and I'm not sure that Gary surely must know this, but a lot of people apparently don't, including other of the best-known apologists that you know quite well. When scholars call a tradition like 1 Corinthians 15 a pre-Pauline tradition, they appear to think that that means that it was a tradition that was around before Paul converted. And that is not what it means. So my first PhD seminar I took when I was a master's student at Princeton Theological Seminary. The seminar was called Creeds and Hymns in the New Testament. We spent the entire semester studying pre-literary traditions in the New Testament. Not just Paul, but a lot in Paul. And I wrote my term paper on Romans chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, an extended 30-page study of those 2 verses trying to show that they were pre-Pauline. And never, ever did it occur to me that somebody would think that means that they were around before Paul converted. Pre-Pauline means that this tradition was floating around before Paul wrote it in this particular work. That's what the term means among New Testament scholars. But people who aren't New Testament scholars apparently hear that term and they think pre-Pauline. Oh, that must be, before Paul was converted. Well, you're just coming up with your own definition. It isn't what anybody's talking about. It's like saying pre-Pauline means it was around before Paul was born.
Right? Yeah.
Pick some other time that's pre-Pauline. And so I think it's just I don't know if it's based on a misunderstanding, but how he can imagine that I've thought that the Creed of 1 Corinthians 15 was around, some months after Jesus' death in Jerusalem is beyond me, because I've never thought that, never said it. So to quote me as supporting it is really, it's really a bit outrageous. And if he wanted to know what I thought about it, why didn't he just ask me? I've got email. We've met before. So I don't know. If that's how he writes his book, I'm not very impressed.
He cites page 131 of Did Jesus Exist, where you say,
for now, I simply want to point out that this visit is one of the most likely places where Paul learned all the received traditions that he refers to, and even the received traditions that we otherwise suspect are in his writings that he does not name as such.
To be clear, when you say traditions here, you don't specifically mean the creeds, as Gary is conflating.
Well, I was just leaving it vague. My view is that Paul spent 2 weeks with Peter in Jerusalem, and at first he says he was the only one he spent time with, and he says, oh yeah, and I did see James. So it sounds like maybe he went there to consult with Peter. In my judgment, he did not go to consult with Peter about the historical Jesus. He went there because he wanted apostolic support for his mission to the Gentiles. Peter was the head of the church in Jerusalem. Paul was converting Gentiles and telling them they didn't have to become Jewish. He knew that there were other people, especially the leadership in Jerusalem, that disagreed with him, and he went in order to work that out with them so that they would support his mission. And so it wasn't about finding information about Jesus. So that's the first thing. I don't think he was sitting there taking notes from Peter about it. But my sense is that if he spent 2 weeks with Peter in Jerusalem trying to work out this missionary thing, that certainly Peter must have said something about Jesus and about his understanding of things. And so that's all I meant. You'll note, I say it very generally. Paul a couple of times he quotes Jesus. He quotes Jesus to say that a workman is worthy of his hire, and he quotes Jesus to say you shouldn't get a divorce. First in chapter 9, second in chapter 7, and then he quotes him a third time in 1 Corinthians 11, where he reports the words at the Last Supper. And I would assume that he got it from Peter, but I don't know that. I'm not firm about any of those that he got from Peter. I'm just saying he got stuff from Peter, and he must have gotten something from him, because can't imagine they were just talking about his mission the entire time.
Paul said, Galatians 1:18, he said, 3 years later, this is after his conversion, so conversion plus 3, I went up to Jerusalem. I spent 15 days with Peter and James. The text in the book is the gospel. And in Galatians 1:18, there's a Greek word, hysteresis. The root word for the word hysteresis is, if we transliterate it to English, most of our audience, I think, will recognize this, Histor, history without a Y. It's the Greek word from which we get the English word history.
Is that correct?
Is it the Greek word from which we get history? Yes.
Well, okay.
Does that have any relevance to what Paul means?
That's the question.
The way you decide what a verse in Greek means is not by finding what an etymology of an English word is, and then say the etymology of the English word shows you what the verse means. And so it is a word that can refer to telling a story. Our word story comes from it too, by the way. You might point that one out to him.
Okay, perfect.
Story. So it often can involve telling a narrative. It can involve having a consultation with somebody, which often would involve a narrative, but not necessarily. If it involves a narrative, who's filling in whom? Gary seems to be assuming that he's going there to get information about Jesus' history from Peter. But when you actually read the passage, it's quite clear that's not what he's talking about at all. I assume Gary's read the entire passage. The passage is about how Paul is trying to set his mission before the apostles so that they will sanction it. They'll agree with it. He doesn't say anything about going there to learn something about Jesus. Just read the entire 2 chapters, chapters 1 and 2. Nothing about that. It's all about his gospel coming straight from Jesus, and he got the Jerusalem apostles to agree with him. That's what the trip is about. And so if there is any narrative involved, the narrative is probably Paul telling them how he had seen Jesus, and Jesus had commissioned him, and how for the last few years, he's been out spreading the word, and he wants their support. Well, you don't want to take it out of context. That's the thing. You don't want to take it out of context, and you don't want to say, because of the etymology of an English word, you know what the verse means.
Right.
That'd be crazy.
But it's used to the first century investigator who's on the scene checking something out. I mean, I guess the best word today would be what we say on a news broadcast. All across the country, 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock, depending on where you live, we get the eyewitness news. And it's the word of, well, there's a big storm out east, and we've got a fella there, and here he is. And, hey, how you doing there? Well, it's really raining hard. Okay, well, thanks for checking in.
What?
Someone's on the scene.
Eyewitness reports? Does he provide a study of this word in Greek outside of the New Testament?
He does not. And as I mentioned, it's only once in the New Testament, so he gets a lot of leeway here, at least.
For some reason, a lot of evangelicals treat the Greek of the New Testament as if it's its own language. It's not just evangelicals, but it's a big problem. So the way they know the meaning of a word is by seeing if it shows up somewhere else in one of the New Testament books. And there's a kind of a logic to that, because that's the only Greek they know. They don't read Greek more broadly. But whoever got the letter to the Galatians had never read the other books of the New Testament. And so when they see the verb historeo, they're not basing it on what other authors are later going to write in the New Testament. They're going to base it on what the word means in their environment. This is a word that they use, and they know what the word means because they use it a lot. So that means if you want to know what the word means in any particular context, you need to see what it meant at that time period among Greek speakers. And you don't do that by finding the one other occurrence in the New Testament. You see what I mean?
Yeah, makes sense.
I can imagine if I'm Paul, what's the one question? If I only get one question, not 15 days, if I only got 1 hour with these guys, what would I say? Here's me. If I'm Paul, I'm going to say, hey, guys, I'm willing to tell you my testimony, what happened to me on the road to Damascus, if you guys will tell me what you saw.
Well, I'm sure Gary would ask that, and I'd probably ask the same thing, but it's irrelevant to interpretation. If you wanted to know what they talked about, read the chapter. So you begin with what Paul is upset about. why he's writing this letter to the Galatians. The thing he's upset about is that there are other missionaries who have come who have argued that his Gentile converts, whom he said you don't need to keep the law to, are now coming in saying you need to start keeping the Jewish law if you want to be a true follower of Christ. Paul's incensed by this. Galatians is one of those few, I think it's one of the two letters of Paul where he doesn't thank God for the congregation. He is really upset.
I didn't notice that. That's what
it's all about them thinking they have to follow the Jewish law. And he ends up having a controversy with Peter. This is what my course is going to be about this issue about to what extent do followers of Jesus have to keep the law or not. This is his concern. It's why he mentions his visit to Jerusalem. It's in order to show that he tried to get these others on his side, and he says that he succeeded. That's the entire point of the book, and it's the entire point of this discussion, and the entire point of his going to Jerusalem. The book says nothing about Paul trying to get information about Jesus. And it is worth noting, I don't know if Gary talks about this or not, it's worth noting that Paul himself, in all of his letters, if you take them all together, says very, very little about the historical Jesus. He only quotes him on the 3 occasions that I've mentioned in all of his letters. He doesn't say anything about Jesus' miracles, or his confrontations with the Pharisees, or his trial before Pontius Pilate, or his transfiguration, or the Barabbas incident, or his baptism, or his temptation. Go down the list. He doesn't say anything about any of these things. So if these are the things that he was most desperate to find out when he went to Jerusalem, why wouldn't he mention them as matters of importance?
Paul was a pretty straightforward guy. He could have gotten a little bit, I don't want to call it a dig, but he could say, no offense, Peter, but man, bummer. You denied your Lord 3 times.
Paul shows no knowledge of Peter ever denying Jesus. Unlike Gary, Paul hadn't read the New Testament Gospels. And they hadn't been written yet, by the way. So,
No.
Yeah, well, Paul might have said that. Paul might have decided he wanted to talk about the weather in Western Asia Minor right now. I mean, I don't know what he talked about.
Now, just a few verses before the Apostle Paul describes meeting Peter, he declares this.
I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel I preached is not of human origin. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ.
I feel like it is setting up that Paul really doesn't want to give Peter credit for anything, that he is basically coming in and saying, look, I met with these guys, but I got this straight from God. These guys didn't influence me.
I think part of that's right. I mean, he's definitely trying to show that he did not get his gospel message from these other people. And it appears that it's because these other missionaries that have come in and said, look, you have to be Jewish. This is what the apostles in Jerusalem are saying. And Paul has changed their message. And Paul's saying he didn't change their message at all. He got his message straight from Christ. And so it is that's right. It is important, though, to pay attention to what he means by gospel in this context.
Oh.
Because this is something people often get wrong.
Yeah, I went back up to Jerusalem to make sure we were all on the same page, to make sure we were all presenting the same gospel.
Paul does not mean his message that Jesus' death and resurrection brought salvation. He didn't learn that first from Jesus because he was persecuting Christians for saying it. So he knew that was their message. In this context, if you read all of Galatians all the way through, especially the first 4 chapters, it's clear when he says his gospel, he's referring to a specific thing, which is his gospel that Gentiles can be followers of Jesus and made right with God without keeping the law. That's the gospel message that he's defending.
Which is why in the next verse he notes, yet not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, even though he was a Greek.
Yeah. He doesn't disagree with Peter that the death and resurrection of Jesus brings salvation. He probably doesn't disagree that Gentiles don't have to keep the law. I think Peter was okay with that to an extent. Their disagreements about something else that's related. But the idea that he's not saying that his gospel is the death and resurrection of Jesus in this context. He's talking about the gospel of justification by faith without keeping the works of the law.
And then just a few verses later, Galatians 2:6, these 5 words in English, they added nothing to me. They added nothing to me.
Now, the interpretation that Gary goes with was, they added nothing to my message means we are in complete harmony and affirmation about the resurrection. But in context, is it reasonable to think this, they added nothing to my message, could just be a rejection that Peter gave him any input, and that he I already knew all this before I came, so don't worry about it. Which of those, or are they both plausible?
It's probably both, I would say. But if it does mean that, when he says they added nothing, that certainly would mean that he didn't get anything from them that he didn't have already. That would suggest that he didn't go there to get information about Jesus that he desperately needed. I think they agreed that Jesus got raised from the dead. Yeah. I think they agreed that Jesus died for sins and he got raised from the dead. That's not what their dispute is about. It's about something else.
Of course, Gary wants to plug this in because we lack firsthand testimony from Peter. So what he wants to say is that because Paul met him, then we're good. It doesn't matter that we don't have that.
Yeah, no, he wants to say that this is eyewitness testimony, therefore. But it's not. Because Paul doesn't say that he learned about Jesus' resurrection from Peter. He says that Peter saw him, but he says that 500 people saw him. And he said that, the apostles all saw him. And he didn't talk to all these people. This is just a tradition that he's heard. And so I have no trouble with Peter saying, yeah, I saw him too. That's fine. But it's not like you don't have Peter's testimony. You have somebody reporting Peter's testimony decades later based on the conversation that he had decades. But I don't see what the big deal is. Everybody, I don't know if everybody, I agree that Peter and Paul and probably Mary Magdalene thought they saw Jesus after his death. That's a given for me. And so I'm not sure who he's arguing against.
I think what he wants to shore up, because it's not one of his minimal facts, and it's actually a huge hole in this giant book, is group appearances is not a fact.
Yeah.
And so he wants to shore up more, I think, the 12 and the apostles and the 500.
Oh, I don't know about the 12 or the 500 at all. I don't think there were 500.
No.
And he doesn't think there were 12, by the way, because he thinks one of them wasn't there. Gary.
Then just 3 verses later, this is where we get the phrase, they laid hands on Barnabas and me, and they gave us the right hand of fellowship. And they said, y'all go to the Gentiles and take this message. We're going to stay here and give the message to the Jews. But the point is, the message was the same. They added nothing to me.
Gary says in the book that why would they extend the right hand of fellowship if they were not lockstep on every piece of doctrine ever? I'm paraphrasing, but that's the sentiment seems to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you have to read the context from which he says it. The reason he went to Jerusalem was to get them to agree that it's okay for him to preach to Gentiles, that they can be justified by faith in Christ without keeping the Jewish law. He indicates that he convinced them. And so they gave him the right hand of fellowship, meaning that they agreed that it was okay for him to continue his mission. So it's got nothing to do with, their belief in the Trinity or something. It's right. Yeah. They're not talking about anything like that. They already agreed that Jesus died for sins and was raised from the dead. The issue of disagreement was about whether Gentiles had to keep the law or not. That might seem kind of a picayune little thing to be arguing about, but for Paul, it was major. For him, if somebody thought differently, they didn't really understand the gospel. And he threatens the Galatians they may be losing their salvation. If they start keeping the law because they think they have to, they don't understand what salvation is. And so for Paul, it's very important. And so that's what he means. And that's why later, when he has this controversy with Peter, it's about something related to that because he thinks Peter has gone back on his agreement. Peter doesn't think so. And an outsider probably says, yeah, it doesn't look like he did, but Paul thought he did.
Well, that kind of leads us into the course that you have coming up, which is going to be free, by the way. That's so amazing.
Freebie.
No, it's free. It's free.
So when people sign up, because why wouldn't you? So is the stuff we talked about today, it all wrapped up in it? And what else will we learn?
Yeah, so it is. And it's the meeting in Jerusalem with Peter and with Cephas, James, and John is really important. The deal is that after Paul meets with them, he and Peter have a falling out in Antioch. Paul reports it as a rather heated affair, and he reports what happens, he explains what happens, and it's not what people tend to think. And so part of my course is going to be explaining what it is they're really having this falling out about. And it's not about whether Jesus was the Savior or Jesus died for your sins or Jesus was raised from the dead or even whether Gentiles didn't have to keep the law or not. It's about the implications of that for the community in Antioch. And it was a severe fallout there. They had a public confrontation that Paul reports. And it's interesting that he reports his side of the argument. And he never reports that everybody agreed with me. He just kind of like he says this statement, like he ends with his like what he said to Peter and he kind of, I showed him kind of thing. It doesn't say, well, then what did Peter say? Or what did most people think? And so the issue is that within early Christianity, you've got two kinds of trajectories with respect to Peter and Paul. you get the trajectory that is kind of what Gary is pushing, which is that Peter and Paul saw eye to eye on everything. They didn't have disagreements. It might look like it at first, but when you actually read closely, they're not disagreeing about anything. And that's the view that goes back to the book of Acts. The New Testament, the book of Acts, absolutely Paul and Peter are simpatico. They're on the same page about everything. But when you read Paul, man, it sure doesn't look like it. And what ends up happening in Christianity is that ends up being two trajectories. One trajectory is a trajectory that says that they completely agreed with everything, and that leads to the traditional Christian views of things, where, for example, Peter and Paul jointly founded the church in Rome, for example, or Peter and Paul were the two main apostles. They got martyred together. They're the togetherness theme. But there's this other thing that people don't know about as much, because a lot of it's in the non-canonical literature, that they continued to be at loggerheads. And you have these writings, some of them claiming to be written by Peter, that attack Paul. In one of them, he's lambasting this person who preaches a lawless gospel to the Gentiles, and he calls him the man who is my enemy. Whoa, really? And so you get these two streams of tradition, including a tradition that says that Paul was responsible for the death of James, the brother of Jesus. And so what my course is going to be, it's going to be 2 lectures of about 40 or 50 minutes each with a Q&A afterward. And it'll be live. People can come to it live. And if they can't come, there'll be a recording of it. That'll be free. And if they do come, they'll get the recording, obviously. And I'll talk about what we can say historically about their relationship, how they related to each other historically, how they're portrayed in the New Testament in relation to each other, and how they're portrayed in later traditions. And it ends up being significant for the history of scholarship. In some ways, the critical scholarship of the New Testament was pushed most seriously in the early 19th century by scholars in Germany who argued that you can trace the developments of Christianity by the arguments between Peter and Paul.
Oh.
And yeah, significant, like the entire history of Christianity. And one of the other things I'll do is I'll point out how the letters of Peter in the New Testament, 1st and 2nd Peter, are almost certainly not written by Peter, I'll be arguing, but they are written to show that Peter and Paul were completely on the same page. And that's one of the major emphases of 1 Peter and 2 Peter, which are written by 2 different authors, but they're both trying to push this. And one reason to push that is because other people think otherwise.
So once again, this Did Peter Hate Paul course is completely free. So if you've ever been remotely interested in seeing what a Bart Ehrman online course is like, this is your chance. And if you use tinyurl.com/BartHate, you'll also be helping me and the mission of this channel. So it's actually a win-win for everyone.
With win-win-win, we all win. Me too.
Well, I have many follow-up questions, but I'm going to save those for the day so that I can insert myself into the Q&A. Thank you so much, Bart. I would like to encourage you to write fatter books because this is clearly the way to go.
Well, and that's volume 1. So you've got a lot of reading ahead of you. And
I do.
Good luck with that.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Talk soon. Sorry, I think I went a little longer, but all right.
Yeah, I think Bart was the one who went on too long.